Hi everybody, I'm making this video today in which I hope to more clearly and more succinctly explain the points that I have touched on in the previous video, and also hopefully in a shorter time, because I think, the other one I do ramble on. But anyway, to start with, first of all, this is a YouTube video that was published on the 24th of May, and this was also on national TV, and it's an interview, well, it's like a tribunal really, in which Jacob Rees Mog MP savages Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, over Brexit figures. And basically the gist of the argument is that Jacob Rees Mog is suggesting that Mark Carney has behaved unethically by, covertly trying to influence the British people's decision on whether or not to remain in the EU by releasing figures, quite damning figures actually, a very depressing economic forecast for Britain if we leave the EU. At least in the short term, and actually after that the long term isn't looking very much better. So, but Mark Carney defends what he's done. He says no, because in a general election nobody can be sure what the outcome will be and which party is going to get in, or if it's going to be a coalition government or a one-party government, and we can't possibly predict for that, you see. He said we can take things into account, but we can't say one way or the other. He said, but when it comes to a decision to leave Europe, it's not the same as a general election, because it's a one way or another situation, and obviously he has a duty to inform his clients, the British people, the public, that this is the economic forecast in the coming fiscal year, and this is what will happen if we leave the EU. If we leave the EU, this is what's going to happen. But, he's being slammed for doing that. Now, in my previous video, I explain how it's the same powers that have been controlling both sides of the debate, and also the main issue within those debates, and the people who have been very concerned about the economic impact and also the social impact in terms of rights have been accused of scaremongering. They've been accused of scaremongering. That's what Boris Johnson has said, and the BBC have promoted that as well, because they've given him a voice to say that, and they've published it on their website. So he's been accused of scaremongering, and the people who've been coming at us with the facts have been, we're the ones that are accused of scaremongering. But then, meanwhile, the other people, the Leave people, are focused heavily on immigration. Now, I was particularly upset with Ian Crane, and I'm not questioning his integrity. He probably believes fully in his heart that everything he's sharing here is true, and he's probably done it with the best intentions. But unfortunately, I do feel that he has misled the British public, and he himself is misled. Because, again, he states immigration as a factor. It's going to drive down wages, it's going to devastate the British economy. There's just going to be hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans all flooding into Britain, because according to the independent people, according to Ian Crane, that is why all these countries want to get into the EU, so they can all rush to Britain to take advantage of our benefit system and our human rights, supposedly, which actually are going. But anyway, we'll come to that in a bit. But, that's basically what he is saying. But in actual fact, by voting to leave the EU, what we have voted for is everything that he said that that he and Boris Johnson and all the Leave campaigners said we were going to suffer through immigration, we are now going to suffer immediately because we've left the EU. And I showed this article on my other video. It states very clearly the pound's already dropped, house prices are going to fall, mortgages are going to go up, your wages are going to be cut, benefits are going to be cut, working tax credit is going to be cut, your freedom of movement is going to be cut. A typical worker will be at least £780 a year worse off. And some people, they've estimated, could be £2,000 a year. Some families could lose as much as £2,771 a year, according to the National Institute of Social and Economic Research. Oh, and now, apparently, there's going to be a size in the shortfall. There's going to be a shortfall, you see, between 28 billion and 44 billion by 2019 and 20. Though, according to Boris Johnson, we were going to be saving tens of billions by closing our borders and prohibiting freedom of movement. But actually what that means is that it's us that have no longer got freedom of movement. Because how likely is Europe now going to grant the British people freedom of movement throughout Europe? You know, and Jacob Rees Mog, you know, that is basically, he then, after Mark Carney explains why he's decided to, you know, release the information about Brexit, he says to him, well, you know, really, you shouldn't have been actually releasing those figures. And the people are now going to be wrongly influenced by you. But actually, how can people make an informed decision if they haven't got all the available facts? Now, as I said, both powers are controlling both issues, both sides, and they've known a long time. They always plan in advance what they're going to do. So this referendum was known it was going to happen from a very long time ago, and they put into place their key players before it happens, and they have their strategy already worked out. And one of their strategies was obviously, look, by the time it comes to the referendum, we've got an American man as governor for the Bank of England. Now, to me, it doesn't make any difference whether he's from the United States or Britain. You know, I listen to what he has to say, and I take it seriously. You know, but the powers that be that control the media and control social dynamics, they know very well that in a social and political climate where a people have been stirred up into ideas of nationalism and independence and Britain being British, they're not really going to take very seriously an American man explaining to them about how bad it's going to be if they leave the EU. Because according to the narrative promoted by the BBC, he was part of a self-serving elite, you see. And as I said, you know, they had George Osborne, and they had David Cameron, liars telling the truth. They had George Osborne talking about the working man, how it's going to affect the working man. It's going to be very bad for the working man, he says. But the establishment put him to say that, because they know very well that any working man listening to George Osborne talking about impacts on the working man is just going to ignore him, because the working man on average doesn't like George Osborne, knows that he's a liar, and has never given a damn about the working man. And that is how they've done it. Now, the BBC suddenly, after the election, now they come at us with the facts. You know, there's no might here. This is will. Now they come out with the facts, And the BBC did not come out with the facts earlier because they were claiming, as Jacob Rees Mog is saying here, that, you know, people like the BBC and the Bank of England are supposed to take a back seat. They're not supposed to express any opinion or share any information that might influence the election. That has to be the British people's decision, you know. They're not allowed to put out forecasts and things like that. But, you know, as Jacob Rees Mog explains, yes, they do, because this isn't the same as a general election. This is a one way or another situation, and the people have a right to know all the facts before they make a decision. And the BBC had all these facts up their sleeve as facts. You know, when did we see them interviewing anybody from the National Association of Estate Agents or the Treasury? You know, did they give a real voice to the real issues here that might have influenced people? And, you know, for me, what I understand is, as I say, it's the same powers that Britain has been completely manipulated. Now, one of the things that Ian talks about here is the risk of a European EU police force and an EU army. You know, and that is presented as a threat. But when we think about it, there's another side to that story, isn't there? Because a police force is both a threat and a safety net, isn't it? It depends how it's employed. Now, you know, perhaps Britain could have really benefited from having a European police force to turn to, when our own police forces are refusing to investigate serious crimes against children because the police themselves are involved in those crimes. An EU police force might have been a useful resource. But we're not going to have that now because we've left the EU. But instead, we will have what Cameron's put into place. Now, would these actually be allowed within the European Union? You know, and we have to think about that. Which would you prefer? An EU police that's committed to EU regulations and laws and upholding human rights, or a corporate police in a country that now we've left the EU, can and will scrap our human rights, so we're going to be under the power of corporate police with no human rights. But according to Ian R. Crane, we should all really have been worried about the EU police. Well, which is worse? Who democratically elects a corporation? At least Europe was, there is some democracy there. And it's like I say, there's a battle here. And it is not about whether or not we stay in Europe. It's the battle that every country, in every people of every nation, every good people are facing today. And it's an oppressive force that's controlling both Britain and Europe. It's controlling every nation through finances. So we're not independent when we haven't got control of our own finances. You know. So this is what's happening in Europe. And this is what's been happening. Every nation, Europe unites in austerity process against cuts and job losses. All the people of Europe, the people of Britain, the people of Germany, France, Spain, Italy, everywhere, the people have been standing up against those economic powers, because it's not Europe that's imposing this austerity. It's not the European Union. It's the economic powers that are controlling the European Union and are also controlling Britain. And so, now that is what we've left. We've left that unity. of the people. And there's a chance that the people together, that we can overcome this corporate madness by having an EU police force, by having an EU army, because that's what it could come to between these corporations. Now, what we also have to recognise here is that there's been a process of history, and time tells a story. And we need to look at that story, we need to listen to it, we need to understand it, because what we understand about what we did yesterday and what happened yesterday, when we understand thoroughly, we can make more wise and informed decisions about what we're going to do today, and thereby move towards the future. Now, in Britain, this was pre-war Britain. Okay, this was pre-war Britain. And Britain had, from the 1750s onwards, the British people were wrongly robbed of their social security, which was our common lands that provided our food, fuel, clothing, housing, water and health, medicines, healthcare. All of it came from our common lands, 80% of the population. And it wasn't until after World War II that people managed to get back that. And we had a 20th century version of it with the welfare state and social security. So that people had a degree of independence and a right to move up, a right to education. And that was what the welfare state was about. It was about telling the rich people, the people who were controlling us, the manufacturers and the factories, that no, you have not got a right to use us as wage slaves and throw us away when you don't need us, because we're human beings and we've got rights. We've got rights to be treated fairly and respectfully, and we've got rights to live in dignity. And we have a right, if you're not offering us a decent wage, then we have a right to say no. We will fall back on our social security. We'll be just live on subsistence. Which is what benefit system was really. It provided a really subsistence living compared to the life of people who were in well-paid jobs. So what they did was then they closed the gap between the workforce and the people on benefits. So actually the people who were working were not much better off than the people who were on benefits. And they did all that with working tax credits, where people end up working for the benefits. And then so they're not living much better than people on benefits who aren't having to work at all. And of course there's going to be friction there between those two groups of people, aren't there? So look what happened. In the 60s, the British economy was booming. And then all of a sudden we got dragged in to the EU, and that absolutely crippled our national industries and our welfare state, everything. Everything was downhill from there. And then in comes Thatcher and, sells off all our national assets, And then after that, we get Tony Blair taking us into war, privatising benefits, all kinds of horrible legislations he brought in, set up the family courts, that basically protect paedophiles, And then, finally, David Cameron to decimate the welfare state. And then, all of a sudden, we're out of Europe. We don't listen to him because he's an American. We've all been brainwashed into accepting that, we don't want these foreigners controlling our country, so we're not going to listen to him. We all know George Osborne, is, and David Cameron, you know, look, savage David Cameron grumbles at live Brexit debate, Sky News, because he supposedly was supporting to stay when, as I say, devil's advocate, and that is what they have been doing. And so this really, I would say, the whole debate about whether we leave or stay in Europe, and the referendum itself, is actually a criminal act. It was because it was fraudulent. It was fraudulent, and by today's level of understanding and knowledge, you know, there are psychology and consciousness and social sciences. They knew what they were doing, and the British public have been conned. Now, that is nothing against the British public, and it is no crime to have suffered a crime, you see. And, you know, that's been a common theme recently, that, you know, victims of crime are somehow losers or stupid. No, people are not stupid because they've been conned. That's why cons work, because the people are coerced and manipulated into thinking and believing certain things. And it's being done on a number of levels. It's being done through the alternative media, and as I say, whether wittingly or unwittingly, okay, it is done. But we know that wittingly, knowingly, they've made sure an American has been governor of the Bank of England to inform Britain about the risks of Brexit, knowing full well that just the fact that he is an American is going to have a massive influence on the viewing public. They have, you know, BBC give a lot of attention to George Osborne and have him talking about the economic impact on the working man, when the whole country knows that that man has robbed every worker in Britain. And now the very thing that George Osborne tried to implement, working tax credit cuts, is now going to happen. It will. How will Brexit affect your finances? So, you know, it is very, very serious. And as I say hello to your corporate police. And there's no EU court to turn to now for human rights abuses. And we are going to be a country that has abandoned human rights. And that can never ever be a good thing, you know. And as for the risks of immigration into Britain, the actual truth is that a lot of Eastern Europeans especially were leaving Britain and returning home because their economies are improving and there's more opportunities at home. And there was every possibility that in the near future onwards, a lot of immigrants, people that had come into Britain, were going to be leaving Britain and going back home as conditions and opportunities improved there. And it was equally as likely that there was going to be a mass exodus out of Britain. And actually that could still happen. Though, you know, Boris Johnson is by incentive, is persuading the Eastern, you know, the migrants that are here now, he's persuading them to stay, saying he's going to give them instant citizenship and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I would say to those immigrants, think very carefully about what you might be giving up, and, you know, how easy it is going to be for you to return home or to visit your home country if you become a British citizen. Does that mean you're going to have to give your passport up? I don't know. You know, so there's a lot of things to be thinking about. And as I say, people complain a lot about the immigrants and, oh, it is really bad. But a lot of those people have only come here because of the economic climate that the bankers themselves have created. You know, the bankers that control the Bank of England and that control all the finances throughout Europe, and are putting a heavy pressure on every government in Europe, as they put on Britain, to live in austerity. And now, on top of austerity, we've got to cope with this, a rapidly falling pound and raising of interest rates and a fall in wages and cuts in tax credit. I mean, that is really terrible. And if the BBC had done its job, because this is a threat, this is a threat to children, cutting income off already struggling families in Britain, that's a threat to children, And actually, what we are going to experience now is, these three children, and those two, that is it. And how that is going to improve without the unity and support of all the peoples of Europe together, standing up for our human rights, standing up for our rights to live with dignity and respect, and not dependent, How are we better off now by leaving the EU? So, as I say, I'm going to end it here. I send everybody love and strength. I think that we can address this successfully and lawfully. I think we need to ask for a second referendum. We need to explain to people and get the word out there that, the British people have been conned, and that is a criminal offence, because it means that British people are now at risk and they've been robbed of both rights and income, and that has severely negated every child's future in Britain. And the prohibition of movement, the lack of freedom of movement now is also a very serious issue. So, as I say, I send love and strength to all. Sign the government petition, ask for another referendum, and do people get together and try and find a way of addressing the crimes here. And I do think the BBC has a lot to answer for.